Hola, les damos la bienvenida a una nueva charla de la franja Gestos de la Poesía 2024, Festival de Poesía del Centro Cultural de la Universidad de los Andes. Hoy tenemos como invitado al poeta maorí neozelandés Vaughan Rapatahana. Le damos la bienvenida a esta nueva charla y antes de iniciar, quisiera leer una breve biografía de nuestro poeta invitado. Vaughan Rapatahana vive viajando entre sus hogares en Hong Kong, Filipinas y Aoteaora Nueva Zelanda. Ha sido ampliamente publicado en distintos géneros y en ambos sus idiomas principales, tereo, maorí e inglés. Y su trabajo ha sido traducido al bahasa malasiano, al italiano, al francés, mandarín, rumano y al español. Es autor y editor y coeditor de más de 40 libros. Obtuvo un doctorado de la Universidad de Auckland con una tesis acerca de Colin Wilson, un filósofo británico. Escribe y da varias conferencias acerca de Wilson. Además, Rapatahana es un crítico de las agencias de proliferación del inglés y la consecuente eliminación de lenguas indígenas. Por esto, ha creado y coeditado las publicaciones English Language as Hydra y Why English, Confronting the Hydra, además de otros trabajos académicos acerca de este tema. Es poeta y ha publicado 10 colecciones en Hong Kong, Macao, Filipinas, Estados Unidos, Inglaterra, Francia, India, Australia y Aoteaora Nueva Zelanda. Su libro Atonement fue nominado para un National Book Award en Filipinas en 2016. Ganó el Proverbs Poetry Prize el mismo año y fue incluido en Best New Zealand Poems en 2017. También escribe cuentos cortos y tiene 2 novelas publicadas. En julio del 2018 participó en el Hot Rivers Literary Festival en Francia. En septiembre de 2019 participó en el World Poetry Recital Night en Kuala Lumpur, Malasia. En octubre de 2019 participó en el Poetry International Festival en Londres y también fue parte del Festival Internacional de Poesía de Medellín en agosto de 2021. Es un placer tener a nuestro poeta acá. Vaughan, it's a pleasure to meet you. Dear Vaughan, your poetry manages a very principal theme, right? That's language.
Yes.
And your struggles with this colonization of the indigenous tongues in your country is very present in many of your poems. I wanted to ask you if you could tell us more about this process of colonization of the indigenous tongues of New Zealand and a little bit of that like a colonization process that has taken place in New Zealand.
Certainly. So Te Reo Maori is the Maori language. Reo is language. Maori are the tangata whenua or indigenous people of Aotearoa New Zealand. Their language was deliberately suppressed for a long period of time, from the time the Pākehā or the white man came here in the early 1800s through until well into the 20th century, and only really became revitalized from the mid-1970s on. It's still not fully supported, it's still not taught in all the schools in this country. It's still he whawhai, still a fight, still a struggle to get it available for akonga or students who want to learn it. So that was deliberately suppressed and then haphazardly taught, still not fully sanctioned by the present government, which has gone, unfortunately, reactionary right wing with the new government that came in last year. And now Maori are struggling to get the rights they deserve and already had under the Tiriti or Waitangi of 1840, under a new regime that seems predisposed to undermining those promises, including promotion of the tongue, of the language. So it behoves me to write as much as possible in my first language, which is Te Reo Māori, which is what I do. But it's a fight, it's an ongoing battle, becoming more manifest recently.
Yeah, you've written a lot of papers, academic articles concerning the theme, right?
Yes.
And your poetry books also like center around that colonization process.
Yes, they do. Yes, and historical wrongs meted out to Maori, and not just to Maori, but to other indigenous people around the globe. by the colonizers, who almost uniformly are the Anglo-American nexus, were and still are, because the process of neo-colonization continues today, whereby generally pale-skinned teachers of English go to countries to teach English to local populations who don't really need the tongue, who believe that they need the tongue to somehow succeed. But what they're ending up doing is paying masses of money to pass exams like IELTS and TOEFL, taught by these neo-colonizing teachers who have the luck of the draw because they have the language. Sometimes not the ability to teach it, but they're flown to other countries. And this includes myself, and I'm not a white-skinned colonizer, but I had happened to have English because I was raised in a country where English was the first tongue, could go overseas unilaterally, uniformly, and get good jobs teaching English to students who didn't really need it, never used it. Still continues today.
And do you find poetry a central tool to protect these indigenous tongues that are being suppressed?
Well, yes, because if you write in the tongue, people will read it and pick up on what I'm trying to say. So I write in English about this process, the decolonization, the neo-colonization. I write in Maori about that, and plus historical injustices done to Maori and other indigenous folk around the globe. And poetry is one means of doing. I don't write just in poetry. I write across other genres like literary critiques, and I'm in the process of getting another book published very soon on that basis, about the hydra, the English language hydra, this multi-headed beast that transports itself around the globe. You chop off one head to try and promote an indigenous tongue, but about 6 hydra English language tongues sprout up anyway, under various agencies like the British Council, etc., etc., etc. And I know this happens in Colombia as well. It's ongoing there.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, it is also a great struggle here, because Spanish has also taken over a lot of multi-ethnical panorama, right?
Yes.
Yep. And there are a lot of struggles also of indigenous peoples that are trying to speak again tongues that maybe have been destroyed in the previous centuries, and the struggle is very difficult because there is not like a very conscious or very like, it cannot be pinpointed what exactly was the language that was used before in this city, for example, in Bogota, the Muiscubum. It was an ancient language, but very few people spoke it purely, like
Understood.
in its very origin. And it's the struggle of a lot of people also. I wanted to ask you about your thesis on Colin Wilson.
Yes.
Colin Wilson is this British philosopher, right?
He was, yes. He died in 2013, but yes.
And he was I read a little bit about him. I really didn't know him before reading your bio, but it was very interesting because I read that Colin Wilson was this kind of new existentialist that wanted to find new ways of giving purpose, right, to human life. So yes. I wanted to ask you, if you could tell us a little bit more about your thesis or about your relationship with that philosophy.
Well, I did my thesis, my PhD, last century, based on Colin Wilson's theory of existential literary criticism, by which he meant all literary works, poetry, novels, non-fiction really, anything written should be judged by the criteria of existential literary criticism, which means what is this work saying about why we are alive, the meaning of life, what we are doing in our existence. So that's the prime criteria Colin Wilson introduced way back in 1958 in Eagle and Earwig, an anthology of his non-fiction writings about literature, existential literary criticism. So I applied that critique to his own novels, which he's prolific about and wrote many novels, to see if if Colin Wilson's own theory matched what he was writing. So that was the basis of my thesis. So Wilson's one of the few philosophers, British philosophers, Anglo philosophers, who actually delved into existential topics. Why are we alive? And now we're here, what should we do about it? He wasn't all involved in silly language games or analytic philosophy. He was far more intent on getting some sort of metaphysical approach to life sorted out. And which is why he delved into large areas about crime and the occult and other very esoteric aspects. Very interesting man whom I met in Melbourne in 1993, where I interviewed him for my PhD thesis, and I kept in touch with him. And there are ongoing Colin Wilson conferences in Nottingham every couple of years. There was one last year, which I've attended, and people give papers. So his name is right out there. He's now far more respected academically, but still not sufficiently to be taught in universities, which is what my hope would be, because he's still seen as an eccentric outsider. The title of his 1956 best-selling book, The Outsider. That's Colin Wilson. That's Colin.
And it's very interesting, this proposal of making this work of art be a tool to find purpose in life, right?
Yes, that's right.
I wanted to ask to you what criteria does this search for purpose is found in Colin Wilson's philosophy?
It's found in his philosophy, and he's a positive existentialist. He's saying, yes, there is meaning out there, but it resides within mankind, and it's up for man to develop his own consciousness and super consciousness to find this meaning. So mankind has the keys to the kingdom of meaning inside his head, and to develop the visionary powers, which can be conveyed by poetry, by the way. He wrote a book called Poetry and Mysticism, can be conveyed by powers of seen as super conscious, but which Wilson inherently believed mankind has in here, like pre-recognition and clairvoyance. Tamir. And Tamir is Maori for etc., etc., etc. So he firmly believed that and strained and strived to show these ideas in his novels, and continuously and copiously, some people say too much because he wrote so many books, in his non-fiction works. He's basically saying there's more out there that's within mankind to develop himself, to attain a wider consciousness, and thus open the doors of existential being and revelation.
And could you maybe try to explain to us what that like super consciousness maybe is? It's like an union with God, enlightenment, or what is that goal?
Well, it's an ability to have ongoing positive experiences, or what Abraham Maslow called peak experiences, P-E-A-K, where suddenly, like those Donald Duck comics where you see a light, those Disney comics, the cartoon character has a light go off on the picture saying, revelation. Colin Wilson's trying to say mankind's capable of developing himself to have a permanent light glowing up from his head, having a wider consciousness where everything matches up and all things mesh together and everything makes sense. The past can be revealed. Mankind can go back to the past and relive his experiences just by recollection. His whole vision is wider. So what Abraham Maslow quantified as a peak experience, Colin Wilson saying can be manifested permanently. And he himself had these experiences, although he had not done so permanently or perpetually. So that's the theory. Okay. And as I keep on saying, he is fairly unique. He was an outsider because he's one of the few British philosophers or Anglo philosophers to subscribe to that life philosophy, which is why he lived way up in Goranhaven, a small village in Cornwall, kilometers away from the nexus, the urban centers. He was outside.
And could you say that a poem like your poem about swans at Lake, I forgot right now the name.
Lake Maraetai.
Of the lake. Yeah, that could you say that maybe that poem maybe tries to delve somehow in this mystic experience we're talking about?
Yes, because I live in a small town in the middle of the North Island of New Zealand, which has a large, lovely lake. And when we take our dog for a walk there just about every day, you've got the black swans live on that lake tranquilly, peacefully, and you can actually get uplifted spiritually, especially on a fine day, which it's not at the moment because it's freezing here, it's winter. You are transported by the sight of the birds serenely feeding their young or diving for fish on the lake, and it's a beautiful vista. And just that can trigger a wider consciousness, just like that. Like Wordsworth did the same with his poetry. He could be spiritually transported by the sight of nature. And I'm saying in that poem that it definitely can be done without the hubble and bubble of noisy people and cars and motorbikes and too many people and pollution spewing buildings. You can go out to nature and you can enjoy its tranquility, and then suddenly you'll lurch yourself into a wider vista. Yes, that poem is all about that. Yes.
Yeah, that's a beautiful poem. And reading your poetry, I also find that there's this need for communication, right? Like this need to reach a point of communion, maybe between different parts, maybe with the swans, right? And
Yes.
maybe with the people that speak in other languages,
Yes.
maybe with your dead son, right?
Yes.
In this poetry, like communication is very central, but I find very intriguing that in this the poem about your dead son, you say that it's a one-sided conversation, and as if you felt that you're not being listened to, or you cannot be heard. Could you talk about a little bit about that poem? It's very profound and beautiful.
That one's about my son Blake, who committed suicide in 2005. At the time, it was a one-sided conversation because he had just died and he was lying in a funeral home, dead, mort. Since then, far more awareness of an interrelationship between him spiritually and myself. So often I feel as though he is present, not visible, but definitely present. So that's an evolutionary process of my relationship to him, sorting out my own guilt and anxiety and sadness about his unexpected death, and the acceptance that he's out there, he's okay, and he at certain times will relate to me through various messengers, or like the birds, like the piwaka waka, the fantail, which in Maori folklore is a messenger, is a conduit between the spiritual life and the human, or the existential life we live in while we're still breathing. But there's more than one world. There's today, but today also there's a whole spiritual realm out there where he is, and where you can have intermediaries between the worlds. So I graduated from that poem, which we're talking about, to having a conversation with him now, or being aware of his signals and signs, or in my own duress and recent illnesses, his presence to push me along a bit more.
It's also what you speak about in another poem about the listening of the birds, right?
Yes. Yeah, the birds are messengers. They're intermediaries. That's dead right. They're kaitiaki. They're guardians of the spiritual world, and they will help if and when needed. Or they'll come up to you and talk to you and give you a sign that they are with you, that they support you. We strongly believe that. I've written poems about that. Definitely the birds, yes.
Would you like to read a poem now that you mention it?
I'll read one poem, which you might. It's called Ha Pi Waka Waka. Pi Waka Waka is the fantail, the small bird with a fan-shaped tail, which is very garrulous, very friendly, but it's seen generally as a positive intermediary between the spiritual world I'm talking about and the everyday world. Okay, between the tapu and the noho. So ha pi waka waka, ke whia koe inaene taku hoa iti. He manu me he waha roreka, he whai kōrero pene I he waiata, te wā katoa. Hei aha tō kōrero e hoa, hei aha te tikanga o tēnei ko weti karawhiti. Kaore o ho he mohio, no te mea kua nunumi ke koe ki te tahi atu he wahi. Kaore o ho he kite I tō whatu kanapa. Kaore o ho he rongo I tō pūrā kouroa. Kua nāro koe inaine, me ke te nere a ho I a koe. Ha, pi waka waka. Ke whia koe inaine. Now I'll read that in English, okay? It's about the fantail who live around this house and communicate with me at certain times. In fact, they won't leave you alone. They'll come right up to you, fly around and around you, talking the whole time. So, English. Hey, fantail, where are you now, my little friend? A bird with a dulcet voice, an oratory like a song all the time. What is your story, friend? What is the meaning of this one-sided conversation? I do not know because you have already disappeared to another place. I cannot see your glistening eyes. I cannot hear your long tail. You are lost now, and I am missing you. Hey, fantail, where are you now? So that's that poem. Complete.
Thank you. It's a great poem, man. Thank you for reading it to us. And it's very interesting that like poetry becomes this ability to speak to other dimensions of reality, like the spiritual world. I think a lot about Orpheus when you talked about your experience with your son.
Yes.
Because I had a teacher that told me that like the foundational experience that brought him to poetry was the same experience that Orpheus had, the need to speak with the land of the dead, or the land of the other world. And it's amazing that that poetry becomes this spell words, maybe, right? To open your eyes to a reality that is the reality of materialism and of colonization also. Like maybe that's the reason also why poetry is so important. What do you think about like the use of poetry in the struggle against colonization?
It's key. It's vital. It gives a voice to those who are the strugglers. It's a weapon, really, if wielded cogently and coherently and consistently. Yes, vital. Has to be done, preferably in your own indigenous tongue, against the colonizing tongue.
And how did you find poetry? Where were your first experiences with poetry?
It's quite a while ago, but I think I wrote as a sort of form of catharsis. I had to write to stay sane, had to express my emotions after various vicarious life experiences. So poetry helped, was primarily initially a selfish act to sort myself out and my feelings about certain things that happened, and it just grew from there. I find myself writing it more and developing and getting better at it, and then finding an audience. But initially, it's a very personal experience of catharsis, and it continues to be now, of course, because there's always things happening that you need to write about. Have to, otherwise you'll go local. Yes.
Local. Yeah. And do you find like the same relationship with other genres, like short stories or novels?
Yeah, I do the same with, especially my short stories. I write about the colonial process. I just had one published last week called Whitey, which I can send to you, which I can't. I'm not going to go into detail about now, but shows quite a cynical attitude towards the colonization process, where the white person is the sublimated one and no longer exists, has been forced out of existence in this country, as opposed to what's really happening. So, yes, short stories definitely do the same thing.
And what authors are you reading right now, or what authors have influenced your writing or your understanding of the creative act?
Other poets, because I'm often called on to review other poets. So I'm always reading other, especially Maori poets, but I'm doing a lot of editing of anthologies. So having it's quite a large number of important anthologies of Pacifica poets. That's New Zealand poets of Pacific origins who live in New Zealand, like Samoa, Tonga, and places like that. And of course, I am the series editor of a new series of writing by Maori that are Maori writing tuhi is burgeoning, growing rapidly. So I'm anthologizing. I'm the series editor of anthologies on that basis. I'm doing a lot of that, which doesn't really incorporate my own writing as much as the new writing of the burgeoning Maori voices and the burgeoning Pacifica voices, because New Zealand is becoming more and more multicultural, even though, as I go back and reiterate, the present regime seems to want to make it monocultural all over again, which is retrograde, and it will never happen because there's too many people of different nationalities in the country now.
And what are your thoughts like in the reception of poetry in New Zealand? Are people reading a lot? For what you just told me, people are writing a lot.
Yes.
Is poetry like an everyday experience for the people?
I think it's become far more general. Yes, more and more people are writing, especially people from different cultures, as opposed to the mainstream monolingual English grouping, who seem to be slightly sublimated now by the huge plethora, or the plethora of multilingual, multicultural voices, and it's being read. Yes. So over the time I've been writing, maybe the last 20 years, it's grown. So there's far more poets, far younger poets, far more women poets, far more indigenous poets, far more poets of other cultures than mainstream, dare I say, white, monolingual English-speaking poetry, and other genres. Yes. The money might not be there from the government, who seem to become meaner and meaner about allocating funding, but the writing pool is deep. So one of the books I edited called Te Awa o Kupu means the river of words. The river is getting longer, wider, faster, deeper. That's of Maori writing. Te Awa o Kupu.
Wow. Well, that's beautiful to hear. It's becoming like kind of a weapon for resistance.
Yes,
for a lot of people.
Definitely in this country and in other countries, of course, definitely.
In terms of language, like maybe more in a more aesthetic aspect, I find that your poetry is very narrative, right? And it maybe doesn't find a lot of places for a lyrical or very metaphorical creation of images. Is this something that you've consciously chosen, or this is just what happens when you write?
No, I think I consciously choose to portray imagery, especially in a new or novel way, which means utilizing language to do so, and often using language, even English language, in a sense that it's not normally used in. So throwing English language back on itself by use of certain esoteric, not so widely used English vocab to sort of reflect on the English language itself and draw out images that way. So yes, it's a deliberate act to create imagery, to make it striking and make people think, wow, yes, that's a good point. So yes.
That's great. And do you find that the poetry that's being written in New Zealand has finds that style, like, how do you say that? Like, try to also follow that style, or is it very different?
Some I don't think we can generalize. There's different sorts of poetry. There's a lot of prose poetry written in New Zealand. You know prose poetry. There's a lot of flash fiction, which can be qualified as poetry written in New Zealand. The vista is wider. The subgenres of poetry are more manifest, which is all good. And there's now more and more people at least trying to incorporate some te reo Māori in their poetry, or Pacific tongues, or even in Asian tongues, because there's a burgeoning population of Asian New Zealanders nowadays. So the whole country's far more multicultural than when I grew up here 100 years ago. And the poetry and the literature is reflecting this slowly and gradually. Just that the government, as I will repeat myself, the funding isn't there to publish it all right now. New Zealand seems to be going through a phase with its fairly newly elected government. But I'm being repetitive, but it has to be pointed out.
Of course, no, it's absolutely necessary. And I am curious about a tradition on poetry, both in the Maori line and maybe the colonial line. What kind of tradition flows into the New Zealand poetry?
Well, the Māori have our poetry called moteatea, which is song poetry, is to be performed. It was always an oral presentation, not written. We didn't have a written language until the white man came. So everything was oral and remembered and extempore, and that's moteatea, which I'd like to see more of incorporated into modern day poetry. Some poets are working towards it way, and there's various subgenres of moteatea. So Māori have their own large oral tradition of presentation and stylization of poetry, or song poetry, like in waiata, pāteri, ori. There's just certain types of poetry. Now, the English language tradition got thrown at us all at school, especially last century when I went to school 100 years ago. We got thrown things like Keats and Shelley and Wordsworth and Byron, because one, the New Zealand poets weren't as manifest, and two, because we were still being sublimated quite seriously and drastically by the British colonized majority of educators. In fact, when I went to school, our national anthem was God Save the Queen, which is absurd. So I went to school in South Auckland, which is primarily Polynesian Māori students, and we all had to stand up and sing God Save Our Gracious Queen, and we used to look at each other in befuddlement and bewilderment. That's how much we were colonized. When I went to school in the mid-1960s, there was no te reo Māori offered. There were no Māori kaiaka or teachers available to teach it. So things have graduated from there, and the English language poetry now is nowhere near as pushing that canon of those traditional Wordsworthian type poets. I'm not saying they're bad or anything. They're valuable, but the English language tradition now has started to incorporate New Zealanders of writing in English with a New Zealand ambiance to it. the matchup between more tia and English has not really quite gelled yet. There's still two separate traditions. I try and do both.
Wow, maybe you're becoming a link.
Yes, perhaps. I just do what I have to do, compelled to do.
And we're arriving at the end of our interview, and maybe I wanted to ask you if you can tell us how do you imagine a future in New Zealand poetry? Where do you think it is going? Where do you would want it to go?
Oh, I think it's I won't say thrilling because that sounds a bit extreme, but I think there's a very strong future of New Zealand poetry because there's so many young writers, including Maori, as I said, writing poetry, vibrant poetry, critical poetry, clever poetry, and performance poetry. So it can only become a wider range of, the future looks good. Just needs more funding so people can get their books published and other people can then buy the books. But the audience is there, the performing poets are there, the writers of poetry are there across all the genres. So the future in poetry in Aotearoa is good.
We would love to get some of that here to Colombia. I think it's very important that there are greater links or relationships between international poets, because listening to you and we learn of a story that it's not easy to get to know here, and it's an entirely other tradition. And just about a week ago, we met other Puerto Rican poets that spoke about another process of colonization of their own island, and it's amazing how poets and intellectuals can bring those stories that are not usually, they're kind of invisible
or sublimated. And, yes.
Yeah. So it's amazing that poetry can bring those story near to you, and you can make relationships between your own experience and the experiences of
it internationalizes. Yes.
Vaughan, so it's been a pleasure. Thank you so much for this conversation.
Oh, gracias. I'm very happy to have helped, and I hope it helps everybody. And best wishes to everybody in Colombia who are fighting their own battles. Ongoing.
Yes, we are. But we're together still. We're connected.